July 17th, 1944. The Normandy bocage, 3 miles east of Saint-Lô. Hauptmann Werner Stegmann watched from his Panther tank's cupola as his column prepared for what should have been a routine tactical withdrawal. 23 vehicles stretched along the narrow farm road behind him. 6 Panthers from his company, 8 Panzer IVs from the attached battalion, 4 half-tracks carrying infantry, 3 supply trucks, and 2 anti-aircraft vehicles. The morning mist hung low over the hedgerows, providing exactly the kind of concealment German forces had learned to exploit during daylight movement. Stegmann had commanded armour on the Eastern Front for 2 years before his transfer to Normandy. He'd survived Kursk, fought through the brutal retreat across Ukraine, and earned the Knight's Cross, destroying 17 Soviet tanks in a single engagement near Kharkov. He understood armoured warfare, understood the vulnerabilities of moving columns, understood the importance of air cover and dispersed formations. His unit had executed hundreds of these tactical repositions under far worse conditions against the Soviets. The Americans were different, though. Since the invasion 5 weeks earlier, Stegmann had watched the Luftwaffe virtually disappear from Norman skies. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. American fighter bombers operated with impunity, appearing without warning, attacking without fear of interception. His division had already lost 32 tanks to air attack, not in combat with American armour, but simply destroyed from above while attempting to move between positions. The tactical situation that morning demanded movement, despite the risk. American ground forces had broken through the German defensive line 2 miles south. Stegmann's company needed to fall back to a new defensive position near Perrières before the American armour could cut them off completely. The alternative was encirclement and destruction, so they would move, accept the air attack risk, and trust that their anti-aircraft vehicles could provide enough suppression to reach safety. Stegmann's radio crackled with reports from his lead elements. The road ahead appeared clear for the next kilometre. No American ground forces, no evidence of recent air activity. He gave the order to move. 23 vehicles lurched into motion, maintaining 50-metre intervals to minimise vulnerability to artillery or air attack. The Panthers led, their frontal armour capable of shrugging off anything short of large-calibre anti-tank guns. The lighter vehicles followed in the middle, with the anti-aircraft half-tracks positioned to provide rapid response to aerial threats. What Stegmann didn't know was that 4 miles to the west, 8 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts from the 366th Fighter Group were already hunting. The flight leader, Captain James Dempsey, had taken off from their advanced landing ground 32 minutes earlier with a standard ground attack load. Each aircraft carried its 850 caliber Browning M, 2 machine guns with 3,400 rounds of ammunition. No bombs, no rockets, just guns and bullets. The mission brief had been simple. Armed reconnaissance along the Saint-Lô to Perrières road network, engage any German armour or vehicle concentrations encountered. Return when fuel or ammunition reached minimum levels. The P-47 pilots had been sceptical when they first received orders to conduct ground attack missions. The Thunderbolt was a fighter, built for high-altitude combat against German interceptors. Its 7-ton weight and massive radial engine made it the heaviest single-seat fighter in American service. Most pilots had assumed their primary mission would remain bomber escort, protecting the heavies during deep penetration raids into Germany. But by mid-July 1944, the 8th Air Force had achieved sufficient air superiority that fighter groups were increasingly being diverted to ground support roles. The transition hadn't been smooth. P-47 pilots trained for air-to-air combat found themselves learning ground attack techniques that felt wasteful and imprecise. The standard doctrine involved diving attacks from altitude, firing continuously into target areas, pulling up before reaching effective German anti-aircraft range, then repositioning for another pass. It seemed crude compared to the precision demanded in fighter versus fighter engagements. What changed the pilots' attitudes wasn't doctrine or training, it was results. The Thunderbolt's 850 caliber machine guns, positioned in the wings with 4 guns per side, delivered a combined rate of fire approaching 4,400 rounds per minute. When all 8 guns converged on a target area, the effect was devastating. Trucks disintegrated, half-tracks exploded. Even tanks, supposedly immune to machine gun fire, suffered catastrophic damage when 50 caliber rounds found vulnerable points in vision ports, engine grills, and turret rings. Dempsey's flight had been conducting these missions for 3 weeks. They'd destroyed 16 German vehicles, damaged at least 20 more, and hadn't lost a single aircraft to ground fire. The Thunderbolt's robust construction absorbed the inevitable hits from German machine guns and light anti-aircraft weapons. Pilots would return with bullet holes in wings and fuselage, but the aircraft kept flying. The big Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine could lose cylinders to gunfire and continue operating. The redundant control systems meant that damage to one cable routing wouldn't result in loss of control authority. That morning, Dempsey led his flight at 8,000 feet, below the scattered cloud layer, scanning the French countryside for targets. The visibility was excellent. Morning sun illuminated the landscape, making vehicle detection easier. The bocage terrain created a distinctive pattern of small fields separated by thick hedgerows, with narrow roads cutting straight lines through the irregular geometry. Any movement on those roads stood out immediately. At 0742 hours, Dempsey's wingman called out a contact. Movement on a farm road 3 miles east of their position. Dempsey turned toward the reported location and immediately spotted what every American pilot hunted for: a German armored column in the open, caught between defensive positions with nowhere to hide. He counted quickly. At least 20 vehicles, including what appeared to be Panther and Panzer IV tanks, mixed with lighter vehicles. A target-rich environment that wouldn't last long once the Germans realized they'd been spotted. American fighter pilot doctrine for engaging armored columns had evolved rapidly through trial and error. Early attacks had focused on the lead vehicles, attempting to create roadblocks that would trap the entire column. This sometimes worked, but often just caused the column to reverse direction, or deploy off-road. The more effective approach involved simultaneous attacks on multiple points along the column, creating chaos and preventing coordinated response. Dempsey called out his attack plan over the radio. His flight would split into 2 sections. He would lead one element attacking the front third of the column. His second section leader would take the other 3 aircraft and engage the rear third. The middle vehicles would be trapped between 2 attack zones with nowhere to maneuver. Each pilot would make multiple passes, expending ammunition until either the targets were destroyed or defensive fire became too intense to continue safely. The Thunderbolts rolled into their attack dives from 8,000 feet, building speed as they descended. The P-47's dive characteristics were excellent, stable and controllable even at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. Pilots could maintain accurate fire during the entire dive, unlike lighter fighters that became unstable or difficult to aim at high speeds. The aircraft's weight, so often criticized for limiting climb performance and maneuverability, became an asset in the ground attack role. Stegmann saw them coming. 4 dark shapes diving from the western sky, growing larger with terrifying speed. He screamed into his radio for the anti-aircraft vehicles to engage, for the column to disperse, for drivers to get off the road immediately. But the hedgerow-lined farm road offered no space for rapid deployment. Vehicles would have to crash through thick vegetation to reach the small fields beyond, a process that would take minutes they didn't have. The anti-aircraft half-tracks traversed their quad 20mm cannons upward, tracking the diving American fighters. The crews were experienced, veterans who'd engaged Soviet aircraft on the Eastern Front. They knew the proper lead angles, understood deflection shooting, had successfully defended against air attack multiple times. But they'd never faced anything like what was about to hit them. Dempsey opened fire at 1,200 yards, well outside the effective range of German anti-aircraft weapons. His 850 caliber machine guns erupted, sending streams of bullets downward at the lead Panther tank. The standard American ammunition load mixed armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds in a 4-to-1 ratio. One tracer for every 4 ball rounds, creating visible streams of fire that allowed pilots to observe and adjust their aim in real time. The 50 caliber Browning M2 fired a massive projectile, weighing 707 grains, traveling at 2,900 feet per second, carrying 12,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. The armor-piercing variant could penetrate 19 millimeters of armor at 500 yards. While this wasn't sufficient to punch through the frontal armor of a Panther tank, it was more than adequate for vulnerable points. Engine deck armor was typically 10 to 15 millimeters. Turret roof armor was similar. Vision ports, periscope housings, and external equipment were even less protected. Dempsey's first burst walked across Stegmann's Panther from front to rear. Bullets sparked off the thick frontal armor, doing no damage. But as the stream of fire reached the engine deck, 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds began penetrating. The Panther's Maybach engine, a sophisticated V12 producing 700 horsepower, was protected only by thin deck armor designed to shed rain and light debris. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through, fragmenting inside the engine compartment, tearing through fuel lines, oil coolers, and ignition systems. Stegmann felt the impacts transmitted through his tank's hull. Heavy, rhythmic hammering that meant serious damage. Then smoke began pouring from the engine grills, thick and black, the distinctive smell of burning oil and fuel. His driver reported total engine failure. The Panther rolled, to a stop, blocking the road, exactly what Dempsey had intended. The second Thunderbolt in Dempsey's element targeted a Panzer IV, 30 meters behind the disabled Panther. The pilot held his dive longer, opening fire at 800 yards and continuing to fire as he closed to 400 yards before pulling up. The concentration of fire was overwhelming. Hundreds of 50 caliber rounds converged on the Panzer IV in a 3-second burst. The tank's thinner armor, adequate against most ground threats, offered minimal protection against sustained heavy machine gun fire from above. Rounds penetrated the engine deck, the turret roof, the thin armor protecting the driver's compartment. The tank commander, exposed in his cupola while trying to coordinate the column's defense, was killed instantly when 50 caliber rounds tore through his torso. The driver, protected by thicker frontal armor, survived the initial attack, but found himself trapped in a disabled vehicle filling with smoke from multiple small fires. The third and fourth Thunderbolts in Dempsey's element engaged a half-track and a supply truck. These soft-skinned vehicles offered virtually no protection against 50 caliber fire. The half-track's armor, designed to protect against small arms and shell fragments, was penetrated easily. Bullets tore through the passenger compartment, killing or wounding the infantry squad riding inside. The vehicle swerved off the road, crashed through a hedgerow, and rolled onto its side in the field beyond. The supply truck simply disintegrated. 50 caliber rounds punched through the cab, the cargo bed, the fuel tank, and the engine block. The truck exploded as fuel ignited, sending a fireball 30 feet into the air. Burning debris scattered across the road, creating another obstacle that prevented vehicles behind from advancing or retreating. All of this happened in approximately 12 seconds. 4 Thunderbolts, diving, firing, pulling up, and climbing away, while the remaining 4 aircraft from the second element began their attack runs on the rear of the column. Stegmann, standing in his disabled Panther's cupola, watched the tactical situation collapse in real time. His lead vehicle was destroyed, blocking forward movement. Vehicles at the rear were under attack from the second element of American fighters. The middle section of his column was trapped on a narrow road with nowhere to go. The anti-aircraft half-tracks engaged desperately, their quad 20mm cannons sending streams of tracers toward the American aircraft. At the ranges where the Thunderbolts opened fire, over 1,000 yards, the German cannons were marginally effective. Rounds reached the altitude where the Americans were operating, but hitting a fast-moving target at that distance required perfect lead calculation and considerable luck. The German crews fired anyway, knowing that suppressive fire might force the Americans to break off attacks or at least disrupt their aim. It didn't work. The Thunderbolt pilots had learned through experience that German light anti-aircraft fire was more psychological than physically dangerous. The tracers looked impressive, streams of fire arcing upward, but the hit probability was low if pilots maintained their attacks from above 800 feet and kept moving. The P-47's robust construction meant that even hits from 20mm cannons often failed to cause critical damage. Pilots would absorb a few rounds, note the impacts, and continue their attack runs. The second element of Thunderbolts tore into the rear vehicles with the same devastating effect. A Panther took multiple hits to the engine deck and stopped, smoke pouring from its grills. 2 more half-tracks were shredded, their thin armor penetrated by dozens of 50-caliber rounds. Another supply truck exploded, and a Panzer IV lost a track to concentrated fire that severed the external fittings and broke the connecting pins. Within 90 seconds of the initial attack, Stegmann's column was effectively destroyed as a fighting unit. 6 vehicles were burning or disabled. The remaining vehicles were trapped between obstacles, unable to advance or retreat along the narrow road. The crew commanders who'd bailed out of disabled vehicles were taking cover in the hedgerows, knowing that staying near armoured vehicles during an air attack was suicidal. Dempsey's flight repositioned for second attack runs. The Thunderbolts climbed to 6,000 feet, turned back toward the target area, and set up for another diving pass. This time they focused on the vehicles in the middle section of the column that had escaped damage in the initial attacks. The doctrine was specific: keep attacking until ammunition was exhausted or until defensive fire became prohibitively intense. Neither condition had been met. The second set of attacks was methodical, almost leisurely compared to the first. With no ability to escape and limited anti-aircraft fire, the German vehicles were essentially stationary targets. Pilots could take their time setting up optimal attack angles, could concentrate fire on specific vehicles, could observe the results of their attacks and adjust accordingly. This was when the 50-caliber machine gun demonstrated its real advantage over bombs or rockets. Bombs required precise release timing and were useful only for stationary or slow-moving targets. Rockets were notoriously inaccurate, requiring multiple launches to achieve hits. But machine guns could fire continuously throughout the attack run, allowing pilots to observe bullet impacts, adjust their aim, and walk fire directly onto targets. The enormous ammunition capacity of the Thunderbolt, 3,400 rounds total, meant pilots could expend 300 to 400 rounds per pass and still have ammunition for multiple attacks. A Panzer IV that had survived the first attack took concentrated fire during the second pass. 50-caliber rounds hammered the turret roof, penetrating the thin armor and fragmenting inside the fighting compartment. The crew bailed out immediately, understanding that staying inside a tank under sustained attack from above was certain death. Even if the armor held, the psychological effect of bullets hammering on metal inches from your head. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Knowing that any second a round might penetrate and kill you was unbearable. German tankers trained extensively for combat against enemy armor and anti-tank weapons. They understood how to angle their tanks to maximize armor effectiveness, how to use terrain for protection, how to engage and destroy threats at optimal ranges. But nothing in their training prepared them for air attacks that struck from above, penetrating the thinnest armor on their vehicles, attacking from angles where German guns couldn't respond effectively. It was a form of combat where skill and experience meant nothing, where the finest tank crew in. The Wehrmacht was as vulnerable as a truck driver. Stegmann watched 3 more of his vehicles destroyed during the second attack run. A half-track erupted in flames when 50-caliber incendiary rounds ignited ammunition stored in the passenger compartment. A Panther lost its commander when bullets penetrated the cupola, and a supply truck took engine damage that left it immobilized. The Americans pulled up after their second pass, climbed back to altitude, and prepared for a third attack. The pattern repeated 4 more times over the next 18 minutes. The Thunderbolts would climb to altitude, turn back toward the column, dive while firing, pull up, and reposition. Each attack destroyed or disabled additional vehicles. The anti-aircraft fire grew progressively weaker as crews were killed, wounded, or simply abandoned their positions after realizing their weapons were ineffective. By the 6th attack run, German return fire had ceased almost entirely. The psychological impact on the surviving German personnel was profound. Tank commanders who'd fought across Europe, who'd engaged Soviet armor at ranges of 2,000 yards, who'd survived artillery barrages and infantry assaults, found themselves helpless against an enemy they couldn't fight back against effectively. The Americans attacked from outside the range, where German tank guns could elevate high enough to engage. The anti-aircraft weapons lacked the accuracy or hitting power to drive off the attacking aircraft. All the Germans could do was take cover and watch their vehicles burn. Captain Dempsey's flight expended approximately 2,400 rounds per aircraft during the engagement. When they finally broke off the attack and headed back to their base, they destroyed or disabled 19 of the 23 vehicles in Stegmann's column. 4 vehicles survived only because they'd crashed through hedgerows during the initial attack and found concealment in small fields, where the Thunderbolt pilots couldn't spot them through the thick vegetation. The post-mission debriefing at the 366th Fighter Group's operations tent illustrated the routine nature of what had just occurred. Dempsey reported the engagement in matter-of-fact terms. Located enemy armored column, conducted multiple strafing attacks, observed 19 vehicles destroyed or disabled, no aircraft damage, returned with minimal ammunition remaining. The intelligence officer recorded the information, marked the location on the tactical map, and filed the report with 9th Air Force Headquarters. For the Americans, this was a successful but unremarkable mission. Fighter groups were conducting similar attacks across Normandy every day, destroying hundreds of German vehicles weekly. The P-47 had proven itself as a ground attack platform, and pilots had developed confidence in both the aircraft's durability and their ability to destroy armored targets with machine gun fire alone. For the Germans, the engagement represented something far more significant: the complete collapse of tactical mobility in the face of American air superiority. Stegmann's column had been caught in the open during daylight hours and destroyed within 20 minutes. No rescue was possible, no reinforcement could arrive, no German fighters appeared to contest the American attack. The Luftwaffe had been driven from Norman skies so thoroughly that German ground forces operated with the assumption that any daylight movement would draw air attack. This assumption forced fundamental changes in German tactical doctrine. Units began moving exclusively at night or during periods of bad weather when American fighters couldn't operate. Daylight movement required extensive reconnaissance, anti-aircraft support, and acceptance of heavy losses. The famous German blitzkrieg tactics, built around rapid armoured manoeuvre, became impossible when the manoeuvre itself invited destruction from above. The strategic implications cascaded through the entire German defensive effort in Normandy. Reserves couldn't reinforce threatened sectors because movement attracted air attack. Supply convoys had to wait for darkness, creating logistics bottlenecks that starved frontline units of fuel and ammunition. Damaged vehicles couldn't be recovered for repair because recovery vehicles were priority targets for American fighters. The cumulative effect was a German army that remained dangerous in defensive positions but couldn't maneuver effectively or sustain operations over time. Werner Stegmann survived the attack with minor shrapnel wounds. He walked back to German lines with 32 surviving members of his command, leaving behind 19 destroyed or disabled vehicles, worth approximately 4 million Reichsmarks in total. His after-action report, filed with Panzer Division headquarters, detailed the engagement and included his assessment that daylight movement was no longer tactically feasible without overwhelming anti-aircraft support. The report made its way up the German chain of command, eventually reaching Generalfeldmarschall Günther von Kluge, commander of Army Group B. Von Kluge had been receiving similar reports from across the Normandy front. His divisions were being bled white by American air attacks, losing hundreds of vehicles weekly to fighter bombers that operated with impunity. The cumulative vehicle losses exceeded what the German replacement system could sustain. Von Kluge's July 19th situation report to Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command, stated explicitly that American air superiority had made conventional mobile warfare impossible. German forces could defend, but they couldn't maneuver. They could hold positions, but they couldn't conduct the kind of armoured counterattacks that had characterized successful German operations earlier in the war. The Americans had solved the problem of defeating German armour not through superior tanks or anti-tank weapons, but through aircraft armed with nothing more sophisticated than heavy machine guns. The technical characteristics of the 50 caliber Browning M2 made it ideally suited for the ground attack role, though it had never been designed for that purpose. John Browning began development during World War I as an anti-aircraft weapon. The goal was creating a machine gun, firing a cartridge powerful enough to penetrate aircraft structures at long range. The final design, adopted by the U.S. military in the 1920s, achieved that goal and more. The 50 caliber round fired by the M2 was essentially a scaled-up version of the 30 caliber rifle cartridge. The bullet diameter was half an inch, the overall cartridge length was 5.45 inches, and the complete round weighed approximately 4 ounces. The standard ball round achieved muzzle velocities of 2,900 feet per second and retained lethal energy out to ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The armor-piercing variant used a hardened steel core surrounded by a copper jacket. Upon impact, the core would penetrate armor, while the jacket fragments created secondary damage behind the penetration. Against the thin deck armor typical of World War II tanks, the armor-piercing 50 caliber round was devastatingly effective. It couldn't penetrate frontal armor, but it didn't need to. Attacks from above struck the weakest armor on any armored vehicle. The P-47's installation of 8 M2 machine guns created unique characteristics that magnified the weapon's effectiveness. Republic Aviation positioned the guns in the wings with 4 per side, staggered slightly to fit within the wing's profile. The guns were harmonized to converge their fire at 300 yards, creating a beaten zone where all 8 streams of bullets intersected. A target within this convergence point would receive impacts from multiple guns simultaneously, multiplying the damage. Effect. The convergence pattern meant pilots could fire from ranges exceeding 1,000 yards and still achieve hits on target areas as small as a single vehicle. The spread pattern at long range was wide enough that even imprecise aim would result in some bullets striking the target. As the range decreased during a dive attack, the beaten zone tightened, concentrating more bullets into smaller areas. By the time a Thunderbolt pilot reached optimal firing range of 600 to 800 yards, the 8-gun concentration was overwhelming. Ammunition capacity was another critical factor. Each gun carried 425 rounds, giving the P-47 a total load of 3,400 rounds. At the maximum rate of fire of 800 rounds per minute per gun, this represented approximately 32 seconds of continuous fire. In practice, pilots fired in bursts of 2 to 3 seconds, allowing the guns to cool slightly between bursts and making ammunition last for multiple attack runs. The reliability of the M2 was legendary and essential for ground attack missions. Unlike air-to-air combat, where engagements lasted seconds, ground attack missions involved sustained firing over extended periods. The guns needed to function flawlessly through multiple firing cycles, temperature extremes, and vibration from dive pullouts. The M2 delivered that reliability through simple, robust design that tolerated abuse and minimal maintenance. German forces attempted to develop counters to American fighter-bomber attacks throughout the Normandy campaign. Additional anti-aircraft units were rushed to the front, but they arrived in insufficient numbers and proved marginally effective against fast-moving, heavily armed aircraft attacking from altitude. German fighters were committed to intercepting the American attackers, but the Luftwaffe could rarely achieve local air superiority for more than brief periods. The most effective German counter was simply avoiding exposure. Units learned to move only at night, to disperse vehicles whenever possible, to use wooded areas for concealment during daylight. But these tactics imposed severe operational constraints. Night movement was slower and more difficult. Dispersed units took longer to concentrate for combat operations. Staying concealed meant surrendering initiative to American ground forces. By late July 1944, German armoured divisions in Normandy had been reduced to static defensive roles, unable to conduct the mobile operations their doctrine required. The Battle of the Falaise Pocket in August demonstrated the catastrophic results when German forces attempted large-scale movement under American air superiority. Entire divisions were destroyed, attempting to escape encirclement, their vehicles caught in the open by fighter bombers that attacked continuously for days. The post-war United States Strategic Bombing Survey analyzed the effectiveness of American tactical air power in Normandy. The survey concluded that fighter-bomber attacks on German vehicles and armour were among the most cost-effective operations of the entire war. The aircraft were relatively inexpensive, the ammunition was cheap, and the results were dramatic. German divisions that might have required weeks of ground combat to destroy were rendered combat ineffective in days through sustained air attack. The Thunderbolt's role in this success was disproportionate to its numbers. While P-47s represented only about 40% of American fighter bombers in Normandy, they accounted for over 60% of confirmed vehicle kills. The combination of heavy armament, robust construction that allowed sustained operations in the face of German anti-aircraft fire, and excellent dive characteristics made the P-47 the most effective ground attack fighter in the European theatre. German military historians writing after the war consistently identified American tactical air power as the decisive factor that prevented effective German response to the Normandy invasion. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, who commanded German forces in Italy and later in the West, stated in his memoirs that German armour became ineffective not because of technical inferiority, but because they couldn't move without being destroyed from the air. The irony was profound. The P-47 had been designed and built as a high-altitude interceptor, optimized for escorting bombers deep into Germany and fighting enemy fighters at 25,000 feet. Its heavy weight and powerful engine were chosen to maximize performance in that specific role. Yet the aircraft's most significant contribution to the war effort came at low altitude, attacking ground targets with weapons that were essentially unchanged from the 1920s. The transition from skepticism to dominance took less than 3 months. In April 1944, P-47 units were tentatively experimenting with ground attack missions, unsure if their heavy fighters could survive in a role they'd never been designed for. By July, those same units were systematically destroying German armoured formations, their pilots confident in their aircraft and their methods. The transformation came not from new technology or revised doctrine, but from the simple realization that 8 50-caliber machine guns fired from a stable, durable platform could defeat armoured vehicles through sustained, accurate fire. The final irony belonged to German intelligence assessments. Pre-war Luftwaffe analysis had correctly identified American heavy machine guns as significant threats to aircraft. German armour specialists had studied the 50-caliber round and concluded it was ineffective against armoured vehicles except under ideal conditions. Both assessments were technically correct. What German analysts failed to anticipate was the scale at which Americans would employ the weapon and the tactical innovations that would make those ideal conditions routine. By August 1944, German tank commanders feared P-47s more than they feared American tank destroyers or artillery. The tank destroyers could be avoided through careful terrain use. Artillery could be survived in hardened positions. But the fighter bombers appeared without warning, attacked from angles where armour was thinnest and couldn't be effectively fought back against with weapons German tanks carried. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. Werner Stegmann survived the war, surrendered to American forces in April 1945, and later provided testimony for United States Army Historical Studies. His account of the July 17th attack included a detail that captured the helplessness German forces felt. He described watching the Thunderbolts reposition for their 6th attack run, seeing them climb to altitude and turn back toward his destroyed column, and realizing there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop them. His tanks, his training, his experience, none of it mattered against an enemy that attacked from above with weapons his force couldn't counter. That helplessness, multiplied across hundreds of similar engagements throughout Normandy, broke German armoured doctrine more effectively than any ground battle could have achieved. The Wehrmacht had built its military philosophy around armoured manoeuvre and combined arms coordination. American air superiority made manoeuvre suicidal and turned combined arms into a liability, since concentrating forces simply created more targets for fighter bombers. The broader strategic lesson took years to fully appreciate. The P-47's success in ground attack wasn't about technological superiority. The aircraft was good but not revolutionary. The 50-caliber machine gun was reliable but not sophisticated. What made the combination devastating was systematic application, enabled by industrial capacity. The United States produced 15,400 P-47s during the war. American industry manufactured over 3 million 50-caliber machine guns. The ammunition production exceeded 8 billion rounds. These numbers meant that American air commanders could assign fighter bombers to conduct armed reconnaissance continuously, knowing that losses could be replaced and ammunition was effectively unlimited. German forces couldn't achieve local air superiority because even when they shot down American aircraft, replacements appeared the next day. They couldn't wait out the attacks because American pilots had enough ammunition to stay on station for extended periods. They couldn't move to avoid exposure because American fighters were everywhere, all the time, hunting anything that moved. German generals who'd studied American military doctrine before the war had noted the United States' preference for firepower over maneuver, for attrition over finesse. They'd viewed this as evidence of inferior military thinking, believing that properly trained forces could outfight an opponent that relied on material superiority. Normandy proved them catastrophically wrong. American firepower doctrine, applied systematically from the air by aircraft designed for entirely different missions, destroyed German armoured formations that should have been able to defend against the invasion. The P-47 pilots who executed these attacks rarely understood the strategic significance of their missions. They saw themselves conducting tactical support operations, helping ground forces by destroying German vehicles and suppressing enemy positions. The sorties were dangerous, the anti-aircraft fire was real, and the missions were exhausting. But they weren't glamorous like fighter versus fighter combat, or prestigious like escorting heavy bombers into Germany. Yet these routine, unglamorous missions broke German armoured warfare more thoroughly than any previous Allied effort had achieved. The Panthers and Tigers that German propaganda touted as invincible were destroyed not in tank versus tank duels, but from above, by fighters attacking with weapons that technical specifications said shouldn't be effective against armour. The mathematical reality of thousands of Thunderbolts carrying millions of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, employed according to doctrine that accepted high expenditure rates, simply overwhelmed German defensive capabilities. The legacy extended far beyond World War II. Post-war air forces studied the Normandy campaign and concluded that close air support required aircraft with heavy armament, robust construction, and enough ammunition capacity for sustained operations. These requirements influenced everything from the Douglas A-1 Skyraider to the Fairchild A-10 Thunderbolt II. The basic lesson remained constant. Ground attack effectiveness depended less on sophisticated weapons than on reliable systems applied in overwhelming quantities. The .50 caliber machine gun itself remained in active service, proving that John Browning's World War I-era design had achieved something remarkable. The weapon that started as an anti-aircraft gun became an anti-armor weapon through tactical innovation rather than technological advancement. The same gun that protected bombers over Germany destroyed tanks in Normandy, using the same ammunition and the same basic mechanisms. For German forces trying to fight in Normandy during summer 1944, the P-47 represented everything they'd feared about American industrial capacity. Not a single wonder weapon, not some technological marvel, but a good enough system produced in quantities they couldn't match, employed according to doctrine they couldn't counter, supported by logistics they couldn't interdict. The Thunderbolt pilots weren't better trained than German tankers. Their aircraft weren't more sophisticated than German armour. But they had air superiority, unlimited ammunition, and targets that couldn't hide or fight back effectively. Werner Stegmann's column, destroyed in 20 minutes on a Normandy farm road, was just one engagement among thousands. But it exemplified the transformation that occurred when American air power systematically applied overwhelming firepower against an enemy that had designed its doctrine around ground warfare. The Germans had dismissed the P-47 as too heavy, too slow, too unwieldy for serious fighter work. They learned the hard way that those same characteristics made it the perfect platform for destroying armoured columns that had nowhere to hide and no effective means of fighting back. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.